Welcome to AM Insider, a production of our own. In this podcast, we will have a series of informative discussions tackling the adoption of additive manufacturing, answering those burning questions and swapping experiences. Learn from experienced individuals on how innovation can push the boundaries of what is possible. Hey, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Justin Hopkins, and with me here as always is Dustin Klumpkin. Let's get inside AM.
You talked about creating a positioning difference between a model versus a 3D printed part. And with what you guys had in your head with how you wanted it to play out versus how it actually played out, as you know already, and what you kind of hit on, how well do you think that worked out? And maybe what advice or input would you give to, say, a product manager who's trying to come up with those differentiators? It kind of, to me, it sounds like you want to stay open to, what happens if the media latches on to something like that or something like that. I'm kind of curious what you might say to that.
You said for a product manager how to approach. There's a certain amount of ambiguity, right? And of course, some people like it that way, right? Some companies who made, let's say, some of the new printers maybe didn't exactly know how to focus either. So what were they happy to do? They were happy to confuse the buyer so that they didn't know that they didn't want their product and they wanted the Stratasys product or whoever, 3D Systems, whatever. So I guess if you're new in the space, different things happen. I mean, that's another thing that's happened in this industry over time is, how newcomers were in the field. And in the 90s, newcomers were defensive and said all kinds of weird stuff sometimes. And new people into the industry, probably for the first 20 years, had a hard time settling into their own happy groove. And, for example, you'd go into a trade show and a new entrant into the industry, whoever it was, somebody who had an actual product for commercial, et cetera. And, there was probably 6 or 8 of them back in the 90s. And I don't know, I'm just putting a number, but in that magnitude, it wasn't 20 and 30 and 50 manufacturers. But there was a weird thing that would happen when you go to trade shows. You really looked at each other almost like enemies. You didn't look at each other like friends, and not at all. And that changed. That changed a lot when the industry, as an industry, everybody got very comfortable with their own products and didn't feel like they were all fighting for one customer all the time, right? That changed. When the industry grew, then the amount that we all kind of became maybe more cooperative colleagues really settled in. And I want to say that happened probably after the 90s. People were just so cutthroat in the 90s. I just feel like that. And I saw it a couple other times since the 90s or since the late 90s. But more by and large, though, over time, a lot of things change in anything, not just 3D printing. But I think what partially happened is people got pretty comfortable with understanding that there were a lot more customers than one. So we didn't have to always, fight like it was, we had to win or go home, And later on, I think it more rapidly became friendly because, of course, the number of people playing was different, but also because a number of people moved from one company to another. And so we actually had friends at the other companies. It was different in the 90s because it was rare that you had somebody who had already crossed or jumped ship more than once. And now, 20, 30 years later, people moved around and everybody knows a lot of people. And now you realize, man, life's too short. And, there's more than one customer and many of us can coexist as, competitors and we know each other. So now it's just a totally different vibe than it was in the 90s in that respect. But going kind of to your point, when people enter the industry sometimes, and it depends on their own knowledge of their market research on what's their market niche, I suppose. But I think what I've seen happen a few different times is that the less confident somebody is about their position in their product, and the more green the person selling that is. Because 25 years ago, there wasn't a very big pool of people who had ever sold or even worked in this industry, really, compared to today. I mean, it was tiny. So the experience set of a salesperson or an AE even, right, anybody, wasn't as high. So you sometimes overclaim things, right? Some people overclaim things more than others. And what would end up happening, or could end up happening, is you would end up competing against something that you shouldn't be competing against. And I'm kind of coming around circle to your question about how do you tell people, like differentiate stuff. Well, you can create your own terms, but those have kind of been settled, and there are new terms to be used. Whether it's in the metal space or new types of materials and different kinds of terms. But there wasn't a lot of things to differentiate on, 30 years ago. Yeah, you would differentiate powder against, which might not be a thermoplastic, against a true thermoplastic, against a thermoset. You'd go against those things. But people didn't, even as buyers, they didn't really understand, unless you taught them very well, what that meant in the world of prototyping, in terms of functionality or heat testing or whatever. It's so going, coming back in another circle, you say, okay, well, if people enter the industry later, let's say 2008 and 9, 10, those were more probably based on consumer types of products than professional products. I don't want to call them non-professional, but more consumer prosumer than the really big machines, which are aimed more and more and more over time at manufacture, whether it's metals or plastics. So I think when we learned to differentiate using our words, when I talked about creating our own internal view of differentiating our products by use of the word prototyping versus 3D printing versus manufacturing, produce. We use the word produce a part or print a model. That's how we looked at it. So we had to come up for ourselves how to differentiate our own product from our own product, so we didn't kill our own, higher end products. And there were differentiations, but it was hard to communicate to people who needed educated about the whole industry. At the same time, you're trying to differentiate our product line. So we're trying to be consultants, both technical and sales consultants. And part of it was in conditioning people by using language that they're able to paint a picture in their mind of what the value of the output is. Because it's all about the value of the output, right? And the cost of the output versus the value on, where you're going to stand in terms of profitability and return on investment for that. So if you use hard words for expensive stuff, you help condition. If you use positioning words to make sure to paint your product in the position it needs to have to be successful. So going to your question about what do you talk about product managers, you really have to focus in on what, if you're part of the business plan creation as a product manager, which you probably are, maybe not to start the company, but at least for product ranges that you're introducing, then you have to do an exceedingly good job at educating people who have never used this before, who have never considered using an additive device for any purpose, whether it's prototyping, whether it's end-use manufacture, indirect manufacture. You need to understand the demographic of the buyer, why you developed the product in the first place. You went out and did, if you're a big company, you did spreadsheets analysis, left and right about, who will buy what at what price point, and you come up with a product. Well, now, if you're going to target them, you need to find out where they're going to look to try to look for a solution that they don't even know they have a problem, maybe. And now you're going to target market them. And what are you going to do when you target market? You're going to go after the people you created the product for, but now you have to identify, you have to teach them and help guide them at the same time, which is is not easy, or at least it wasn't easy 20 or 30 years ago. And every time the industry makes, a step forward, then it's gonna have a better way to do this, I think, or at least from a market education. Because I don't know what you think, but it's not linear probably, but the amount of education that buyers have needed in the entire time of the additive business, going back to Chuck Hull's first machine, which is almost 40 years ago. It's crazy. It's nearly 40 years ago.
Yeah.
But the amount of education has decreased, at least in terms of maybe some things that are possible. But there's a ton of people. I talk to people left and right out by my pool, which I'm looking at right now. And I talk to them and they want to talk about 3D printing. They're like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you could do that. And I'm talking to people who are technical or maybe even just business. But there's a lot of people who don't know that you might end-use produce parts for a car or for something, right? So education and choice of differentiator words to help get the potential buyers qualified or unqualified quickly, and that from a sales perspective. But if you're trying to condition them that they might want something like this, a year from now, then you have to choose words that cause them to want to come back and talk to you. What does your audience know? What do they need to know? When do they need to know it?
And I think these are excellent points, Tim, and it's kind of some of the reasons why I'm asking you, because obviously this problem has come up over and over again with, how do you position and segment a product and talk about it in different ways of producing a model versus a 3D printed part versus an additively manufactured part. And then, so that's, educating the customer. But in the same token, then you have your internal structure of how you structure the company to align behind that. And, someone told me that kind of around that time, and I don't know if it was exactly that time or a little bit later, but there were different, we'll say product managers. And I think Mary Stanley was heading up, I think it was the Dimension line, if I'm not mistaken. God rest her soul. And someone else was heading up, say, like the Genesis line. And I was told that created some friction within the organization of, hey, whose product is selling better? And hey, are you more of in the Mary camp or the other person's camp? And so the reason why I kind of bring this up is I think it's important for current and future companies to realize that, hey, if you take that positioning approach, you got to really think about how that creates for the internal politics of working together and being successful together as a company. And I'm sure you experience that.
Well, I mean, if you look, if it's inside one company, and again, this, when I mentioned that, back in the early days of Dimension, which preceded, another 3D printer later, a lower cost one, we had to teach a lot of very good people. We had some very good sellers. Now, the people who sold Dimension were probably coming in off of software sales, so they were kind of new at selling the 3D printers, or the Dimension as we had it. And you're right. Internally, if you look, we had a distribution channel that worked different around the world in a couple different spots. And in some cases, we had a separate distribution channel. In the US, it was indirect, through resellers only for Dimension. And of course, we had the big ticket stuff sold directly at that time. And in some places around the world, the same company could sell the product. So in one way, we had to give the tools to both. Even though, let's say, if I go to Europe and I had somebody, a reseller and a salesperson who could sell the entire span of product range and not separated by price point, okay, that's one thing. But the problem for them would be that as a salesperson, I can sell you a $50,000 printer or a $250,000 printer. How am I going to actually explain this to somebody who's new in the 3D print business 20 years ago? And then you go, if in the US, if you have two different channels, so you have a direct channel and they have an indirect channel, they're not going to like each other because one or the other is not going to be able to sell the other product if that's the opportunity they walk into. Imagine that. You have a salesperson who goes into an inquiry to sell, a big box item of a couple $100,000, and the customer's like, well, what's this brochure I see about this dimension? Can I buy one of those? Yeah, you can imagine. Now you have a little bit of a conflict because inside the same company, not everybody can sell everything, if you know what I mean. And you had to teach people inside the company in those scenarios, how to differentiate your own products. Because how do you manage? How do you manage? And you've been in companies that have expanded their portfolios of 3D printer products, and you go from like 3 printers over time to 20 something printers, and you have to teach people as salespeople, as technical and salespeople, and partners and all that, how to use the right words to help more quickly guide a customer. Because you're absolutely right that internally, probably every company has this, where, if you have different product groups, they're going to focus on their product, and there maybe would have some jealousy if another product got more attention in the company or whatever. I'm not saying that's what did or didn't happen, but yeah, I mean, that's a growth moment.
Thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from AM Insider, you can follow us on LinkedIn at AM Insider, or send us an email at justin@aminsider.org or dustin@aminsider.org. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.